Mid-October 2025, Crimea's night sky burned brighter than at any time since the war began. At 23:47 on October 17th, Ukrainian long-range drones struck the oil depots of Kvardysk and Karayern, two fuel lifelines that had fed Russia's entire southern front. Was this just another drone raid or the decisive moment that turned Crimea from fortress to trap? And if a handful of drones could cripple an entire peninsula, what other dominoes were about to fall? Satellite imagery released by NASA firms and BBC Verify confirmed the devastation. 11 giant fuel tanks at Feodosia's main terminal had burned for over 10 hours, sending black columns of smoke visible from space. According to Reuters analysis, the loss equaled nearly 40% of Crimea's total fuel reserves. From that night onward, Russian armored columns stalled. Convoys vanished from satellite tracks. As one defense news expert wrote, "Mobility is oxygen in warfare." Ukraine didn't just light a fire, it sucked the air out of Crimea. This was domino effect analysis made real. One hit on Feodosia cascaded through the peninsula's logistics. Like a chain reaction, no diesel meant no tanks, no transport for ammunition, no evacuation routes. In just 48 hours, what Moscow had portrayed as an unsinkable aircraft carrier became an island slowly suffocating under its own weight. The Ukrainian strategy, months in the making, was brutally efficient to turn Crimea into a prison without walls. From the opportunity cost angle, each destroyed depot forced Moscow into impossible trade-offs. Repairing even one of these fuel sites demanded cranes, engineers, and materials that were already scarce in Russia's heartland. DW's economy desk reported that reconstruction budgets had to be siphoned from domestic energy programs in Siberia and Tatarstan. Every ruble spent patching Crimea was a ruble stolen from Russia's own infrastructure. Meanwhile, Ukraine's tactics evolved. Instead of risking manpower, Kyiv relied on swarms of AI-guided drones launched from Odessa and Zaporizhia. A senior Ukrainian officer told Al Jazeera that each drone cost under $100,000 less than 1% of the price of the Russian fuel it destroyed. It was the perfect strategic contrast to Moscow's billion-dollar logistics, collapsing under technology it had once mocked as garage toys. But the attack's real brilliance lay in timing. It came after a month of constant attrition against supply corridors and radar stations, when Russian defenses were already stretched thin. In Trump's Washington, senior NATO analysts quietly noted the strikes during a closed Pentagon briefing. An anonymous source told the New York Times Ukraine has achieved in weeks what sanctions could not in years. It exposed the structural brittleness of Russia's war machine. As dawn broke on October 18th, Russian soldiers in northern Crimea found their trucks bone dry. Satellite images showed convoys abandoned on the roadside crews trying to siphon fuel from civilian cars. For the first time, Russian logistics officers radioed Moscow not for orders, but for gasoline. By noon, the answer came back: none available. That day, the psychological balance of the war shifted. A single night of explosions had triggered a nationwide logistical chain failure whose impact would echo far beyond the peninsula. The Kremlin's grand narrative of invincibility cracked open, revealing panic underneath. Yet this was only the opening move of Ukraine's larger plan. The real storm was aimed not just at Crimea's fuel, but at its arteries of survival, the roads, rails, and bridges that still connected it to Russia's mainland. What followed next would transform a blockade into a total isolation. By late October 2025, the tremors of Crimea's paralysis had spread northward. Russian soldiers who once bragged about controlling the land bridge now faced a devastating question. How do you fight a war when every road, bridge, and rail line leading to you is gone? Can an occupying force survive once its supply veins have been surgically severed? Ukraine's next stage was surgical indeed. Satellite images obtained by BBC Verify on October 20th revealed that the Armyansk Bridge, the only functioning land crossing into northern Crimea, was struck by a precision Storm Shadow missile. The blast, confirmed by Reuters and Defense News, tore through its central span, leaving trucks dangling like broken toys. For the Russian command, it was the nightmare scenario. Their last overland artery was gone. This operation illustrated the domino effect perspective at full scale. Once the bridge fell, secondary rail lines between Tokmak and Melitopol were flooded with emergency traffic. Within days, Ukrainian FPV drones hunted down those convoys one by one. Videos verified by DW showed dozens of scorched freight wagons, each carrying shells or diesel reduced to molten wreckage. What began as a single destroyed bridge triggered a cascading logistics crisis, stretching 400 kilometers deep into occupied territory. The opportunity cost side of the equation was just as brutal. Each lost supply line forced Moscow to improvise with costly airlifts from Rostov and Krasnodar. Russian Mi-26 transport helicopters, each burning nearly 2 tons of fuel per hour, were now ferrying ammunition that once moved cheaply by rail. As Al Jazeera reported, the Russian Air Force had to suspend several operations in Syria to free aircraft for the Crimea route, a strategic self-inflicted wound. Every liter of fuel spent keeping Crimea barely alive meant less capacity on other fronts. Meanwhile, Ukraine's engineers exploited real-time NATO satellite data. American intelligence, coordinated under Trump's newly re-energized Joint Defense Partnership, provided near-instant radar coverage over the Zaporizhia corridor. A retired U.S. Air Force colonel told the New York Times, "This is 21st century siege warfare, total denial of movement through digital visibility." With Western-supplied precision targeting, Ukraine turned a regional battle into a live mapped economic chokehold. Russia's domestic consequences soon became visible. Trains to southern ports halted, fuel prices in Krasnodar spiked by 15% in a week, and factories in Belgorod reportedly slowed production due to logistical bottlenecks. Military Watch magazine calculated that just rebuilding the damaged rail nodes would cost Moscow more than $900 million and take 6 months' time the front line doesn't have. From a strategic contrast viewpoint, this was Russia's paradox. It sought to hold Crimea as the symbol of strategic depth, yet every measure to defend it hollowed out its depth elsewhere. By hoarding resources for the peninsula, Moscow drained its broader war effort. As Russian generals argued over scarce trucks and engineers, Ukraine advanced its invisible blockade. Drone strikes on depots in Melitopol and Tokmak followed within days, turning temporary chaos into systemic paralysis. NATO analysts described the situation as a logistical blackout. An army still intact on paper, but functionally paralyzed in the field. The human impact soon became unavoidable. Soldiers stranded along the Jankoy rail line scavenged food from nearby villages. Civilians described convoys trading rations for fuel. One Ukrainian analyst told BBC World, "This is not just attrition, it's starvation warfare without a siege line." The question now dominating Western think tanks was chilling. If Crimea is isolated, what remains of Russia's southern strategy? And how far would Moscow go to prevent a repeat elsewhere? Meanwhile, as engineers scrambled to repair the ruins of their so-called fortress Crimea, the very concept of that fortress was about to collapse entirely. What followed next would destroy not just infrastructure, but the myth of Russian invincibility itself. In early November 2025, as fires still smoldered around Feodosia, Moscow's state media clung to a familiar phrase, "Fortress Crimea stands." But reality told a different story. Could a fortress truly stand without fuel, ammunition, or command integrity? Or had Putin's grand vision of an unsinkable aircraft carrier already sunk under its own propaganda weight? For more than a decade, the Kremlin had portrayed Crimea as the crown jewel of its military might, a bastion bristling with S-400 batteries, radar domes, and frigates projecting dominance into the Black Sea. Yet Ukraine's asymmetric strategy unraveled this illusion piece by piece. Western intelligence confirmed that the peninsula's layered air defense, once boasting 90% interception efficiency, had fallen below 40% after months of attrition. According to a BBC defense correspondent, Crimea is no longer a shield. It's a sieve. The domino effect perspective reveals how one breach cascaded into systemic failure. When fuel depots burned, radar generators went offline. Without radar, S-400 batteries operated blind. Once the missile sites dimmed, the skies over Sevastopol opened for Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles. Each strike made the next inevitable, a falling line of dominoes, toppling the myth of Russian invulnerability. From the opportunity cost view, every missile Ukraine fired forced Russia to spend exponentially more defending or repairing. DW Business reported that Moscow diverted $2 billion from civilian construction budgets to reinforce southern air defenses, money originally meant for hospitals and housing in Rostov. As one German analyst remarked, each Patriot fired by Ukraine costs a fraction of the Russian infrastructure it annihilates. The Kremlin's financial hemorrhage became a war of attrition, not on the battlefield, but in its own balance sheets. Strategically, the contradiction was glaring. The strategic contrast perspective shows how Crimea, meant to symbolize expansion, had become a liability chain. Russia's dream of projecting power into the Mediterranean through the Black Sea evaporated when its fleet could no longer refuel or repair. NATO's maritime analysts, writing in Defense News, called this a reverse Crimean War, the empire bleeding out at its supposed stronghold. Trump's Washington seized on this shift. At a late October NATO Council meeting, U.S. officials praised Ukraine's fortress inversion tactic, turning the enemy's stronghold into its tomb. Al Jazeera's diplomatic desk noted that the United States quietly increased intelligence sharing under the Joint Maritime Monitoring Program, providing real-time satellite imagery of Russian naval movements. For the first time, Sevastopol's defense grid was mapped not by Russia, but by its adversaries. Inside the peninsula, morale collapsed faster than concrete. Reports from BBC Verify described Russian troops abandoning bunkers to avoid drone swarms that hunted by heat signature. Commanders relocated to underground tunnels near Simferopol, effectively isolating themselves from the front. Ukrainian psychological operations teams amplified intercepted radio traffic, broadcasting messages that emphasized the hopelessness of the situation. A former Pentagon advisor told The Guardian, "When soldiers believe their fortress is doomed, it ceases to be a fortress, it becomes a cage." The propaganda gap widened. Moscow's nightly briefings celebrated minor tactical victories, while Russian social media channels overflowed with videos of stranded convoys and deserted airfields. The gap between message and reality was now the widest of the entire war, and it was eroding the Kremlin's control of the narrative. Still, the fall of the fortress was only half the story. The next act would unfold at sea, where the Black Sea Fleet, once Russia's pride, faced an equally humiliating reckoning. What followed next would not just sink ships, but sink the very idea of Russian maritime power in the region. By mid-November 2025, the Black Sea itself had turned against Moscow. The once feared fleet, the same force that launched Caliber missiles across Ukraine in 2022, now cowered far from its home port. Could a navy that flees its own harbor still call itself a fleet? The exodus began quietly, caught first by British reconnaissance satellites, and later confirmed by Reuters. Russian warships were leaving Sevastopol under cover of night bound for Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland. What had been advertised as an impregnable naval fortress had become a death trap. After Ukraine's Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles destroyed dry dock facilities and headquarters buildings, Even submarines were hunted inside their berths. DW's defense desk wrote, "For the first time since the Tsarist era, Russia has lost control of the Western Black Sea." This retreat exemplified the domino effect perspective. Once fuel lines and repair yards in Crimea were disabled, every ship that remained became a liability. Crews feared refueling explosions more than enemy torpedoes. The sinking of the Novocherkassk in Feodosia, confirmed by NASA thermal imagery, triggered a chain reaction of panic. Within weeks, the Minsk and Saratov were also gone, each loss compounding the psychological collapse. The fall of a few hulls cascaded into the disintegration of an entire maritime command structure. From the opportunity cost angle, Moscow paid a staggering price. Maintaining naval logistics now required diverting oil tankers and escort vessels from the Caspian Sea Fleet, weakening Russia's influence in the Caucasus. According to Defense News, every emergency transfer of equipment to Novorossiysk cost roughly $25 million and forced delays in other theaters, including the Arctic Fleet. Russia noted one NATO analyst is cannibalizing its navy to keep a ghost fleet afloat. The strategic contrast perspective sharpened the humiliation. Putin's stated objective had been to project power deep into the Mediterranean. Instead, his ships could barely reach open water. Satellite images analyzed by The Guardian showed at least 9 major warships docked idly in Novorossiysk, their engines removed to supply spare parts elsewhere. What was once the instrument of expansion had become a museum of lost ambition. Western experts saw opportunity in Russia's retreat. A senior U.S. naval strategist told the New York Times, "The sea lines once used for coercion are now corridors for observation." NATO reconnaissance aircraft began regular patrols over international waters south of Crimea, monitoring the emptying ports in real time. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Magura V-5 drones patrolled the coast like mechanical sharks, confirming that the Russian exodus was permanent. Trump's administration quietly celebrated the shift, but avoided public triumphalism. Pentagon briefings emphasized that the West had provided eyes, not hands intelligence support without direct involvement. Yet inside NATO circles, the fall of Sevastopol was viewed as the most significant maritime realignment in Europe since 1945. Morale within Russia's naval ranks mirrored the silence of their engines. Communications intercepts released by Ukrainian intelligence revealed captains pleading for spare parts and radar repair crews. One desperate voice message concluded, "We are floating, not sailing." That phrase quickly went viral on social media, symbolizing the hollow shell of Russia's once proud navy. Still, the collapse of naval power was only the penultimate blow. Ukraine's real objective lay just beyond those empty docks, a towering monument of steel and propaganda that linked Crimea to Russia's mainland. The Kerch Bridge had survived previous strikes, but the next assault would test whether Moscow's pride could bear another fracture. What followed next would shake the very foundations of the Kremlin's narrative. Late November 2025 brought an eerie silence to the Kerch Strait. Russian television called it routine maintenance. But Western satellites told a different story, cracks widening across the bridge's central pillars, fuel convoys halted midspan, and Magura V-5 drones gliding beneath the fog. Could Moscow's most expensive symbol of power soon become its most visible symbol of failure? Built at a cost of nearly $4 billion, the Kerch Bridge had long been the Kremlin's pride, the physical manifestation of its grip on Crimea. Yet Ukraine treated it as the heart of a patient, systematic operation. According to Reuters, the strikes between July 2023 and summer 2025 had already weakened the support beams to a critical threshold. What followed next was not a single attack, but a relentless campaign of corrosion precision hits designed to make each weld scream. From the domino effect perspective, the consequences were instant and unstoppable. Once the bridge's capacity dropped below 5 tons, the entire peninsula's logistics convulsed. Food deliveries fell by half. Spare parts for armored vehicles stopped completely. Fuel trucks rerouted to ferries across the Azov Sea, but high winds and Ukrainian naval drones turned those detours into suicide runs. By December, DW reported that 70% of Crimea's civilian goods were arriving by sea through Novorossiysk, an impossible detour that cost Moscow millions each day. The opportunity-cost perspective revealed an even deeper wound. To stabilize the bridge, Russia diverted concrete cranes and engineers from St. Petersburg's urban housing projects and from Siberia's rail reconstruction efforts. Al Jazeera's economic analysis estimated that bridge repair spending surpassed $1.1 billion in emergency contracts, resources stripped from an already bleeding wartime economy. Every bolt tightened at Kerch, noted. The Guardian means one less bridge repaired in mainland Russia, but perhaps the cruelest irony lay in the strategic contrast perspective. The bridge that once symbolized connection now stood for isolation. Moscow's goal had been to link its empire. Instead, Kerch linked its vulnerabilities. A British defense analyst told Military Watch magazine, "It's a billion-dollar reminder that geography can't save bad strategy." Ukraine's Magura V-5 drones, guided by AI and upgraded with thermobaric payloads, turned the strait into a perpetual threat zone. Defense News reported that each wave of 10 drones cost Kyiv less than one Russian anti-ship missile. The equation favored Ukraine with brutal simplicity, cheap persistence versus costly defense. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, now exiled to Novorossiysk, could no longer shield the span. Even the air defense systems once stationed nearby had been redeployed northward to protect key oil refineries around Belgorod. Trump's Washington took note. A Pentagon source told the New York Times that the bridge's eventual collapse would symbolize the end of strategic depth for Russia. Behind closed doors, NATO strategists referred to Kerch as the final domino. Meanwhile, inside, Crimea morale imploded. Civilians whispered that the next strike would cut them off completely. Prices for food and fuel doubled within weeks. Some towns near Jankoy rationed bread. Russian soldiers were recorded driving motorcycles across the damaged bridge to save fuel, their images spreading like wildfire on Telegram. Each wobbling bike became a metaphor for a superpower running on fumes. As winter's first storms swept across the strait, the bridge groaned audibly under its own scars. Ukrainian intelligence hinted that a special operation was imminent, one that would decide whether Crimea remained connected or became an island prison. Yet the destruction of infrastructure was only half the victory. What came next would prove that the real collapse was psychological, not structural. In early December 2025, the storm finally arrived. Before dawn on December 3rd, Ukraine's Magura V-5 swarm streaked low across the Kerch Strait. Moments later, a thunderous crack split the stillness, and one of Russia's last standing illusions fell into the sea. Was this the moment Crimea ceased to be an occupied territory and became a sealed tomb? Within hours, satellite feeds from NASA firms and ESA's Sentinel system confirmed what Russian state TV refused to admit. 2 central spans of the Kerch Bridge had collapsed entirely. Reuters cited Western analysts estimating the loss of more than 10,000 tons of steel and concrete, a blow Moscow could neither hide nor quickly repair. The bridge of the century was now a broken relic, severing the last logistical link to the peninsula. Under the domino effect perspective, the consequences were immediate. With fuel and ammunition trapped on the mainland, Russian units in northern Crimea went dark. Power grids failed within 48 hours as diesel for generators ran out. Naval facilities at Feodosia lost refrigeration for munitions, forcing crews to dump volatile ordnance into the sea. Each logistical collapse triggered the next, a cascading failure of an entire military ecosystem. The opportunity cost perspective deepened the pain. Moscow rushed to compensate with costly airlifts from Rostov, but every sortie drained resources from its own homeland. According to Defense News, the Russian Ministry of Defense redirected $600 million from Siberian oil field development to sustain emergency shipments. As a DW analyst summarized, Russia can either feed Crimea or fuel its economy, but not both. From the strategic contrast perspective, the contradiction reached its peak. Crimea was meant to project Russian power. Instead, it absorbed it. The peninsula, once called an unsinkable aircraft carrier, now anchored Russia's decline. The U.S. Naval War College described the situation as reverse deterrence. Every missile Ukraine launched made Russia more cautious, more cornered. Trump's administration, while publicly restrained, quietly expanded the NATO surveillance grid, integrating U.S. and Polish radar feeds to monitor what one Pentagon report termed Russia's maritime implosion. Inside, Crimea despair replaced defiance. Soldiers rationed ammunition to 5 rounds per day. A BBC World crew that interviewed fleeing civilians in Jankoy recorded haunting testimonies: empty depots, starving garrisons, and officers ordering vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel. One Russian engineer told The Guardian, "We built a fortress, and now we're trapped inside it." The psychological collapse rippled outward. Telegram channels once loyal to Moscow filled with panic posts from relatives demanding evacuation flights. By mid-December, Western intercepts suggested that some Russian officers had begun destroying classified equipment, not from discipline, but hopelessness. This noted a NATO briefing in Brussels is what defeat without battle looks like. For Ukraine, the operation achieved more than tactical victory. It validated years of patient strategy, a triumph of endurance, intelligence, and technology over brute force. Yet even amid celebration in Kyiv, new questions emerged. How would Russia respond to the loss of its crown jewel? Could desperation push the Kremlin toward escalation elsewhere? Meanwhile, the world watched as the last ferries from Novorossiysk turned back empty, the bridge smoking on the horizon. The message was unmistakable. Crimea was no longer a fortress, no longer a gateway, but a grave. Still, this end was also a beginning. Ukraine's success would redefine modern warfare and NATO's doctrine for decades. What remained uncertain was how far Moscow's humiliation would echo within its borders, its politics, and its fading empire.